breaks one tackle, now another, still alive, and that will end the ball game. We will finish in a 20-20 tie.
The failures of the Texans in the year 2022 can be traced back to the offseason with two events, when they had to trade away Deshaun Watson and then they had to promote head coach Lovie Smith from defense coordinator because Brian Flores' scandal with the Rooney Rule. Lovie Smith was ill-prepared to be the head coach. Players regressed like Davis Mills. Rookies that looked promising like Green and Stingley were either injured or did not play well. Lovie Smith won and lost games that he shouldn't have. To start the season, he tied the only game the Houston Texans have ever tied in franchise. And Week 13 against the Browns, a game in which Deshaun Watson played poorly, he decided to start Kyle Allen over Davis Mills. If he started Davis Mills, I believe that they would have won the game, which would not only have been a symbolic victory for the city of Houston, but also an objective win. Moving on from Lovie Smith, let's get on to the next couple of culprits. One of the biggest culprits for why the Texans are in the current state they are is their constant and endless pursuit for a quarterback that has spanned 2 decades. We won't go all the way back to the beginning with David Carr, but let's go back to 2016 when Bob McNair signed Brock Osweiler, a basically 6'7" Davis Mills, if you will, sight unseen. Bill O'Brien nor did Rick Smith confirm or want the signing to happen, and yet it did. Brock Osweiler was signed for 4 years to $72 million, and he lasted 1 year of that 4-year contract. Then, not only that, he was traded to another villain in this story, the Cleveland Browns again, for a second-round pick and a couple of others. Going to the next culprit we have, and Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien coached some pretty infamously bad games, most specifically the 2020 game against the Chiefs, in which Patrick Mahomes threw 5 touchdowns and the Texans had a 21-point lead in the first quarter. Yeah, it's bad. But moving on from that, I think something worse than that is Bill O'Brien's GMship and his trades. I don't know if there's another GM ever in NFL history that's been scammed as many times as him. The DeAndre Hopkins trade, in which he gave away a future Hall of Fame wide receiver for a second-round pick and a washed-up running back. Keep in mind, Hopkins was in the prime of his career. The next trade that he got scammed on is the Laramie Tunsil trade, in which he gave up 2 first-round picks and a couple of others for Laramie Tunsil and Stills. The Dolphins basically rebuilt their entire franchise off of one trade, and it left the Texans depleted. Now we move on to the final bozo to complete this trilogy. We have Deshaun Watson. I want to try to take a different approach than most would, and sort of leave out all the off-the-field issues, as they've been pretty well documented and thoroughly discussed to lengths that I don't feel I can properly give light to. So, leaving that, I think that a lot of people believe that Deshaun Watson at some point in time was a top 5 quarterback, and I'm not sure I personally buy that. For his first 2 seasons, I don't think anybody could argue so. And for his last 2 seasons for the Houston Texans, pretty much the only one you can argue is the 2020 season. And I just think that the quarterback position in that time was just so much better than people think it truly was. So he may have been a top 5 quarterback in a weaker year, but he just wasn't in the year 2020. He didn't lead in passing touchdowns. He didn't lead in completions. The one thing he led in is yards, and he went 4-12. So, Deshaun Watson's greatest season and his greatest feat in the NFL almost 5,000 passing yards led to a 4-12 Texans team. And I know that some people argue that quarterbacks aren't responsible for wins, and I don't personally care because if you look at the two other drafted quarterbacks in the first round of his draft, you have Mitch Trubisky and you have Patrick Mahomes. I'm pretty sure we don't need to look at Patrick Mahomes' winning stats. I'm sure everyone is well aware of how much that guy wins. But I don't think as many people would think that Trubisky has a higher winning percentage than Deshaun Watson and the same amount of games won. Keep in mind, both of these guys have missed entire seasons. Mitch Trubisky, because he wasn't good enough to start and had to sit behind Josh Allen in Buffalo, and Deshaun Watson missed pretty much 1.5 seasons. One on his own volition because he is money hungry and wanted to starve out the McNair family for another contract, and another because the off the field issues. Now we must conclude the tale of the three bozos. We need to go back to 2016 when the McNair family decided to sign Brock Osweiler, and he was a total dud, which led the team to needing a quarterback in the 2017 NFL Draft. There was two other teams, and maybe a couple of others, that needed a quarterback as well. We have the Chicago Bears and the Kansas City Chiefs. The Kansas City Chiefs were pretty desperate for a quarterback. They had Alex Smith, who 2 years prior did not throw a single touchdown to a wide receiver, and the Bears were finally moving on from Jay Cutler. The Bears were sitting at 3. They ended up trading up to 2 to select Mitch Trubisky. That takes one quarterback off the board. The Texans were sitting at 25 and pretty confident and believing that they were going to get Patrick Mahomes. Not only were the Texans confident, but many draft analysts and scouts and journalists also believed, as of late post-Combine, post-Super Bowl, post-NCAA season, that Patrick Mahomes would be a late first-round pick. Well, that wasn't the case, because Kansas City decided to trade up from 27 to 10 with the Buffalo Bills and select Patrick Mahomes. This sent the Texans into a frenzy. They got desperate, traded up to Cleveland, which is kind of ironic, and selected Deshaun Watson. When you look at the two quarterbacks and the respective teams that originally drafted them, they are total opposites of each other. The Kansas City Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes played an immaculate game against the Philadelphia Eagles to win their second Super Bowl. On top of that, Patrick Mahomes already has an MVP, and Deshaun Watson doesn't. Continue with Deshaun Watson. He's currently on his second team, and his team ended up 4th in an AFC North that allowed the Baltimore Ravens to make the playoffs with Huntley as a starting QB. It's ridiculous. Going on to the Texans, they are the opposite of the Chiefs. The Chiefs look like they're pretty much Super Bowl contenders for the next 5 seasons. The Texans would be lucky to finish top 15 next year. Although rebuilds aren't as slow as they used to be, you have teams like the Cincinnati Bengals and the Jacksonville Jaguars who went from top 5 picks to playoff contentions, and in the case of the Bengals, a Super Bowl run. But the Houston Texans would have to luck into a generational NFL starting QB. I'm not exactly sure if Stroud or Richardson or Young or maybe even Levis will be that. But we're gonna see. In the 2023 NFL Draft, the Texans hold a ton of draft capital, so they should be able to get on the right path to make this rebuild work. We've seen other teams, like I showed earlier, the Jags and the Bengals, but there's other teams that are taking it a little slower, like the Jets and the Lions, and if the Texans can even just replicate what those two teams did, those teams don't have a starting NFL quarterback, or at least not a very good one, and Zach Wilson and Jared Goff. But they are making do with stellar other players. The Jets had 2 Rookie of the Years last year. The Texans need to get on that. And hopefully, in the next couple of years, they'll be playoff bound.